All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from a snowy Israel. We're getting, apart from on the Golan, which gets snow far more regularly, we're starting to get snow in the Jerusalem area. I don't think it's going to settle, but amazingly in Israel, considering everything that's going on in Israel and the world, the snow reports led the news and kept hold and rapt attention of the Israeli public for at least 10 minutes out of an hour. It's amazing. I've always said it's amazing no matter what else is going on, wars, conflicts, rocket attacks, Iran. There's nothing which drives Israelis more crazy than the weather. So that's what has been on a lot of Israelis' minds tonight, at least. But I want to take us a few days back, and what everyone was talking about, and still will be once the weather settles, is what has been described as the potential Big Bang of Israeli politics, and that is the possibility of former Prime Minister and leader of the opposition Benjamin Netanyahu leaving politics, perhaps for some time, perhaps even for good. Why? The simple reason is it was released towards the end of last week that negotiations between Netanyahu, his lawyers, and the state attorney's office on a plea bargain. As we know, as we've spoken about, Netanyahu is currently facing 3 criminal trials for fraud, for breach of trust, and for bribery. The most serious one is the 4,000 case for bribery. I'm not going to go into the details. We've discussed them in the past, but this is a case that has the potential to go on for many years. There's a lot of witnesses. The trial already started. Obviously, there could be lots of twists and turns and appeals. This, as I said, this has the potential, if it was to run its course, could go on for years. And during this time, Netanyahu can remain in office, can hold position, not necessarily as a minister, because once you're indicted, you can't be a minister, but at the moment, as head of the opposition, that's no longer relevant. The question that everyone was asking is why, and why now? Ever since this started, Netanyahu's main refrain has been, there is nothing in this case, in these cases, there will be nothing, and I will be acquitted. That was his constant refrain to the Israeli public, and people who support him stood by him on this, and they stood, and according to polls still stand by him, that he should be fighting this to the end. But the question is why? Why now? I think there's many different factors here. First of all, we saw recently that Aryeh Deri, former interior minister, very close ally to Netanyahu, leader of the Shas party, took a plea bargain, and it was considered very, very soft. Considering the case, he got off very lightly. He did resign from the Knesset, but he can run in the next Knesset. Who knows, elections could be in a few months. Well, we'll have to see about that. But he got off relatively lightly, no prison sentence, no a sentence of moral turpitude. We've talked about that before. If someone is convicted of a crime of moral turpitude in Israeli law, they cannot run for office for 7 years. Aryeh Deri actually did serve time and did have that against his name, and he had to take a step out of politics for 7 years, and he waited and he came back. But Aryeh Deri was much younger than Netanyahu is. They say, if this happens, then Netanyahu will be well into his 80s when he could return to politics, and who knows whether he'd be able to. But so that could be one reason. Another reason, which is probably most significant as far as the timing, is at the end of this month, in a matter of, 10, 11 days, 12 days, Avichai Mandelblit, the state attorney, will leave office, and there'll be someone to replace him. If we remember, Avichai Mandelblit went from closest Netanyahu ally, he's the one Netanyahu appointed into the office, to the person who finally put the indictment, has been running this whole sort of affair from start to finish. He's the one probably most hated by the Netanyahu chorus line, the people who support him. No matter what, they blame Mandelblit, they blame a deep state, whatever it is, behind him. And he's become the sort of bugbear of the pro-Netanyahu camp. But he resigns at the end of this month. He leaves his position, his tenure is over. And Netanyahu, there is a belief that Netanyahu thinks that he can get a better deal with Mandelblit. He doesn't know who will come next, but don't forget it's going to be appointed by this change government, this unity government, this government that really despises Netanyahu. So perhaps he's thinking, you know what, Mandelblit, we've fallen out. He's definitely not someone I feel I can trust, but at least I know him. At least I know how to deal with him. It's better to take the deal now than with someone who I don't know, who could be far more antagonistic towards me. It now comes out that there's almost no chance of Mandelblit having the final word on this. First of all, Mandelblit wouldn't have the final word. No state attorney would. They're the ones who negotiate the plea deal, but then it goes to the Supreme Court and they would decide. They have actually made things worse in the past on a plea deal. There was a famous case of former tourism minister Stas Misesnikov, who took a plea bargain and actually ended up doing jail time because the Supreme Court decided that the plea bargain was not strong enough. And that's something that Netanyahu worries about very strongly, because according to all sources, the plea deal would mean no jail time. It would mean 6 to 9 months, something like that, of community service. At one point, there was a debate exactly whether there would be this crime of moral turpitude, but all voices coming out from the state attorney's office are that that's non-negotiable. That has to be there. At one point, there was thoughts that maybe it would be something less than that. Maybe there'd be a deal for him to step out of politics for a few years and not the full 7. But now it seems like Mandelblit has put his foot down and said that it's a non-negotiable, probably because there were a lot of voices that felt what was being talked about was too lenient, with no jail time, with no crime of moral turpitude, with a few months of community service, a fine, an acceptance of guilt or lesser guilt, throwing out case 2000, throwing out the most serious part of case 4000, which is bribery. There was a lot of voices in the judicial system that felt that it was far too soft. So perhaps that's why Mandelblit has taken a far more staunch line at this point. But they say that even if they came to an agreement tonight, and it's clear there is no agreement tonight, it would take a long time to work out exactly the details with each case, what would happen, and then it has to obviously go to the next layer. So they say it's unless there's something extremely unexpected, it's unlikely to happen. And that means that the next Attorney General is going to need time to come in to learn the case, the ins and outs, the details. So now that puts the clock back a certain extent. But it's clear that the Netanyahu camp wants the plea deal. So much so, this is quite remarkable, and this sort of shows where we are today. The Netanyahu and the Netanyahu camp for the last few years have used the whole judicial system as one of their, scapegoats. The judicial system, there's overreach, there's judicial activism, it's got a left-wing agenda, etc., etc. Well, now we have Aaron Barak, former Supreme Court president, who probably more than anyone else in the Israeli judicial system is accused, and rightly so, of being the leader of judicial activism. And it came out that Netanyahu had personally reached out to him to try and push him into the limelight as being pro this plea bargain, because it was felt that someone like Aaron Barak would be extremely, would be listened to, because he is he has that elder statesman amongst the high level judiciary. So it's ironic that Aaron Barak, not only was he reached out to, but he said, the reason I'm doing this is because Netanyahu was always good for the judicial system. He protected us, which again, a lot of people who are hearing those words from Aaron Barak saying that Netanyahu protected the judicial system at a time where they were being led to believe that they were stood in ideological and political opposition to the judicial system, especially judicial activism, would horrify a lot of, and did horrify a lot of Netanyahu and Likud supporters. So we had that sort of bombshell this week. What that means for Israeli politics could be massive. As I said, a lot of people are calling it the Big Bang in Israeli politics. There was a lot of talk about if Netanyahu does leave the scene, how long will this government last? Some people were saying only a few weeks. It's clear that now it's going to be a few months. Even if Netanyahu does resign in all his positions, it's not even clear whether he would need to resign as the head of the Likud, but almost certainly I think he would. And we got all these messages that came out from different Likud bigwigs who said that they will run in the next elections. But if Netanyahu does resign, then it automatically will go to Chaim Katz, who's the head of I believe it's the Likud Central Committee, but he would just be temporary. They would need to have elections within a few months. According to every single poll available, the most popular Likud leader after Netanyahu would be Nir Barkat, by far. The other names out there, Edelstein and Katz, Yisrael Katz, wouldn't receive anything like the support that Nir Barkat would, which would only be a few seats, 1 or 2, maybe 3 seats below what they would receive with Netanyahu. But the difference is the right-wing parties in the coalition would sit with Nir Barkat. Whether they would sit immediately or in the future, that remains to be seen, but he's not Netanyahu. And that means people like Bennett, Gideon Sa'ar, perhaps even Avigdor Lieberman, although he also has a problem with the ultra-Orthodox parties, could conceivably sit. So if Netanyahu does leave, it's almost certain that there is a ticking clock to this coalition. It would be far less likely to survive its term, even perhaps to the point where the swap over of the leadership of the government, the Prime Minister's office, would be handed over to Yair Lapid in 2023. That would certainly be put in danger. The voices from the top, Netanyahu, Bennett and Lapid, are trying to reassure everybody that this government is focused. It doesn't matter what happens with Netanyahu, but clearly it does. It's already being felt in the political scene. For the first time, we're seeing members, more right-wing members of the coalition, voting and even passing bills with the opposition, which is largely right-wing. There's another one, Sharon Cheskel, who is a right-wing member of New Hope, which is a right-wing party, pass a law, or at least pass a reading of a law today with the help of the opposition, which is, again, something that wouldn't have happened a few weeks ago. So we are starting to see that. Well, probably if Netanyahu does leave, and again, now probably the timetable has been put off a few weeks. If the plea bargain will even come in the end, we know that Sarah Netanyahu was for the plea deal and then she was against. Yair Netanyahu was for, against. These are very important figures, and the Israeli media has been analyzing every single figure involved and following Netanyahu and his lawyers around the last few days to see who was meeting who with when. But the fact is that it would have a massive effect. It would start, because simply politics is about leverage. And if Netanyahu leaves the scene, then there is the potential of this going back to this right-wing religious bloc, which, according to seats in the Knesset, is well over, I think, 70 or 80 seats, an easy coalition right there. So the right-wing members would have leverage because the left wing really has nowhere to go, or the left of center, or even the center, whereas the right wing have an alternative government, and that gives them leverage. And also the right wing members might start thinking, if we're going to go to elections, we don't want to be the ones accused of sitting in this left wing government or in this unity government. And the left wing members also may be thinking, if this government is going to break up, I need to at least look like I'm standing firm on my ideological positions. So I think we'll start to see more of that as the Netanyahu plea bargain debate continues. Again, I think now In the last few days, when there's been a bit of an impasse, it seems that there's an agreement on many, many issues, but there are some that are still outstanding. And the fact that there's still no agreement with, as I said, about 12 days to the end of Mandelblatt's tenure, leaves almost no time, again, unless there's something unexpected, to run through all the necessary hoops to finalize this plea deal, which means the next person will come, will have to learn the case, that will put everything back at least a certain amount of weeks. They may come up with a completely different strategy. They may rip up everything that Mandelblatt had built before. Perhaps there will be certain understandings between Mandelblatt and Netanyahu's lawyers. The next state attorney could conceivably, I'm not sure whether they would, because obviously not everyone in the office would leave with Mandelblatt. There's quite a few professionals who would stay. But it's conceivable that the next person comes in and rips everything up and starts again. And that means the whole process takes a little bit longer. Perhaps that will put the Netanyahu side off a plea deal, and perhaps we'd be back to where we were a few months ago before these negotiations even started. So it remains to be seen. It does seem very clear that Netanyahu does want a plea deal. Exactly what that means at the end of the day, what he can get out of it, remains to be seen. But this is very serious, and for Israel's political system, it certainly would be the big bang if it happened. So happy to answer any questions about this or anything else that's on your mind.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have in is from Len Levin. What is the likely legal penalties that would be given to Bibi if he pleads guilty? Prison time, fines?
Well, that's exactly what has to be negotiated in the plea deal. It's not that he would, be convicted or be said to be guilty. That's at the end of the very lengthy legal process. But it seems to be in everyone's interest to get a plea deal, because this is going to be a very messy, very expensive, very elongated legal process, as I said, which could take several years. So it's in everyone's interest to try and find a solution now. And everything will be worked out within the plea deal. What cases or what parts of cases are thrown out. As I said, according to reports, case 2000, there's case 1000, 2000, and 4000. Case 2000 was always the weakest one. And they say that's going to be thrown out. And the harshest crime, which is that of bribery, on case 4000, they said that they'll throw out. Again, it's not that they're throwing it out, but this is the negotiation, quid pro quo. The state will have to give a bit, and the Netanyahus will have to give a bit. So again, there's a lot of discussions of what's going on behind the scenes, but until it's signed, nothing is signed. It's almost like the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations in the past. It doesn't matter how far you go in negotiations, unless you get to the signing, nothing stands. It could from one day to the other or collapse, and then you have to start again. So it remains to be seen exactly what would happen. Of course, if there is a plea deal, he'll have to plead guilty for at least some of the crimes attributed to him, but obviously not all of them, because that wouldn't be a particularly good deal from his side. But from the other side, they would have to make sure they at least get something out of that, and that's where probably, again, the thing that everyone's looking for is this crime of moral turpitude, because that's probably, apart from prison time at least, that's probably the thing that divides the two camps, and something that Netanyahu camp would certainly not like to see. But again, he may have to just give up and accept that.
Thank you. An anonymous viewer asks, how can the Supreme Court have the power to counter a plea bargain or other such cases?
Because they get the final say. This is the negotiations. I guess it's sort of, if I again go back to that analogy of the Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations, at the end of the day, the peace negotiations can be between two sides, but they have to be ratified by the government and the Knesset. So here, as it's a judicial issue, it has to be ratified by the Supreme Court.
Understood. Thank you. Speaking of the Supreme Court, David Rosenberg asks, why has the Supreme Court been so timid about the Sheikh Jarrah evictions?
I mean, first of all, there's lots of different evictions. It hasn't really been timid. It actually ruled it depends what we're talking about. Today, there was the news of a family that was evicted on a relatively new property because they took over a part of property. They built illegally. That property was supposed to be built on by the municipality for special needs school for Arab Palestinian residents. It's not like it was, there was news that came out that it was going to be taken and given to Israeli Jewish schools and all this sort of thing, even an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, but these are all rumors. The facts are that on this property, there was zoned to be a school. It was going to be a special needs school serving the Arab Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah. And last night, the Israeli forces went in and evicted the family that were there, who said that they would commit suicide if they were evicted. It actually went off relatively easy. They're evicted, and I think even as of today, parts at least of that structure were demolished. On the wider issue that came up, obviously, last year, and according to Hamas at least, was part of what ignited the war or the conflict, that's a wider issue. That's more private property. That has been ruled that the property is belonging to the Jewish organizations, but the Supreme Court has tried to take the two sides together to try and find a compromise to avert nasty scenes and all the rest of it. The problem is, while the Jewish side has compromised quite a lot and said, we're not necessarily looking to boot them out, but at least accept that this property is ours and pay a minimal symbolic rent. The other side has been emboldened by some Palestinian extremists, or threatened, perhaps would be a more accurate term, that if they accept such things, they're giving in to the Zionists, and they shouldn't countenance that. But at some point, that time will run out. The patience of the Supreme Court will certainly run out, and I'm sure that they'll be forced to rule. But again, there are other issues involved. If only it was just a real estate issue, which it is, but there are so many other ramifications involved.
Thank you. Reuven Hawk asks, even with the plea deal, could Netanyahu later be indicted regarding the submarine case?
That's an interesting one. So he has never been personally implicated in the submarine deal. Many of his close associates were, very close advisors, a cousin, a former lawyer. What's happening now, and I believe this may be part of what caught the attention of the questioner, is that the government has just decided on Sunday a state investigation into that submarine deal is going to be raised in the cabinet. There'll be discussions. It was put off last week. There was a lot of speculation it was for political reasons, that maybe some didn't want to go for it or whatever, but it seems now it was more to do with the fact that this week there were sensitive negotiations with the German government for more submarines. So they didn't really want to, in the middle of those negotiations, torpedo them, if I may say. So basically, it's going to come up. It's a state investigation. So it's not necessarily going to bring down criminal indictments. And as I said, at the moment, there is no investigation that anyone knows of that's implicating Netanyahu. But obviously, if more information is found, that could change. But at the moment, he is not one of the individuals named in the ongoing criminal investigations.
Thank you so much. So moving on, Larry Greenberg asks, can a government reform without elections? Can some MKs from the coalition join right-wing parties to set up a new government without elections?
Yes, we talked about that. It's a no confidence. I think it's called a constructive no confidence vote, where basically you have to name an alternative government to vote down the current one. You need 61 seats, where at the moment, let's just say the right-wing religious opposition is 53, because there's obviously another 6 from the Arab joint list. So that obviously wouldn't be part of any future government. So they have to find 8 seats. But for example, Tikva Chadasha, New Hope, Gideon Saar's party, Naftali Bennett's party, the two of them together would easily push them over the line. but obviously there'd have to be a lot of negotiations, exactly who would become prime minister, and they actually even have to name a whole government with all the different ministries allotted before the voting comes up. But again, that's the sort of thing that could easily be negotiated behind the scenes in advance. So in theory, yes, there could be a new government without elections. If there is going to be a new government with the Likud in it, in fact, I think that would probably be preferable for Bennett and Saar, whose party is barely, according to some polls, crossing the threshold, and Bennett's party is going up and down in the polls, but certainly they probably wouldn't like to go to polls because their situation in negotiations would certainly be lessened, because according to most polls, that right-wing religious bloc with Likud is getting closer and closer to the 61 on their own. So probably, if we are going to have a new government, it probably will be without elections.
Thank you. And Sandro Bilestrino asked, yesterday, TV7 Jerusalem studio reported that Israel is allegedly supplying natural gas to Lebanon through Syria. Could you shed some light on this as to why Israel might agree to such an arrangement?
Well, it was subsequently denied by all the parties, or at least most of the parties. The only reason I can think of it is because of stability. Israel certainly has an interest in a stable Lebanon. I don't know if it would, you could argue that, helping a government that's heavily reliant on Hezbollah would be a mistake. It remains to be seen whether there is something to this or not. I can imagine there may well be something to it because it's not completely out of the question. It could be part of the negotiations, part of the negotiations between Israel and Lebanon on the maritime border, which obviously has a lot to do with natural gas discovery. So it could be part of the negotiations are to help alleviate some of the gas problems. So then it would agree to fairer terms on the Israeli side as part of the maritime negotiations. Again, I don't really know exactly. I don't know the truth about it. I could see it. I could see there being something to it, but we'll have to wait and see if there really is any truth to it in the weeks to come.
Thank you. In our last few minutes here, can you just give us a little update on what's happening in regards to COVID? One of our viewers asked, he's going to Israel at the end of the month and wants to know if he should reschedule.
Well, considering they've been opening and closing the borders, I'm not sure if you could get in. Maybe it's best to just get in. Probably there's talk that either today, yesterday, in the coming days, we'll reach the peak of the Omicron wave. At the moment, there's about 70,000 plus known cases, probably double, if not more. They say maybe there's even 200,000 a day because a lot of people are not testing in formal facilities. They're doing it at home. But 70 plus known cases a day is certainly surpassing all previous records. But the restrictions are being alleviated now. We're down to 5 days of isolation. They're talking about just getting rid of isolation for school kids because, like everywhere in the world, they're seeing a massive surge in Omicron cases. But what we know about Omicron is it's not as serious, not as lethal as previous waves. And especially if we're already sort of, on our way down with this wave, that it makes no sense to start putting in greater restrictions. So it does seem like in the coming days that we'll already start lowering the number of cases every day. At the moment we're, as I said, we're on the crest of this wave. So I think there's something like 200,000, 250,000 children who are currently in isolation, either because they themselves have coronavirus or they came into contact with someone. I think there's 650,000 people in total. That's in isolation. I think that's maybe something like 6 or 7% of the whole population, which is absurd, and that's the reason why they're cutting everything down. But the debate at this point is not necessarily, is it serious? Are people going to die in very heavy numbers? Because it's clear from around the world, it's not to say no one is dying, not to say every death is not a tragedy, but it's certainly not the numbers that we saw previous waves. So I think like many other places in the world, I saw UK just took down all its restrictions. I think there's an understanding that Omicron is not some of the other variants and has to be treated seriously. And the experts already say that we're probably on our peak at this moment, and probably the days and weeks ahead are going to be lessening. So probably in the next couple of weeks is as good as time as any to visit, I would say. Don't hold me to that, because I'm certainly no health expert, but it does seem that we're on our way out of this particular wave. So perhaps now is the right time to visit. And there's no restrictions. There are restrictions that are coming in the country. You have to be double vaccinated or recently vaccinated in the last 6 months. But apart from that, once you come in, I think that there's no great restrictions.
Sounds good. Thank you for answering that. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you so much for taking time to update us this
Absolutely.
week. And for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar in Qatar's aid charity and investigation. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.